So I think you're always going to come across anger.
And how can we sort of respond to that? Because sometimes I think the natural thought is almost like, oh gosh, what have I said? I've caused that, me and my big mouth.
Yeah. I think we all, I was chatting to you earlier about, my go-to is always, I've done something wrong. So if somebody's angry, I used to think, well, I must have caused that in you. And what a mantra, talking about mantras, I have to say on every single retreat at Rachel's Vineyard, when these women have purposely come, and the men, to deal with their grief, often anger will come up, and it can be aimed very much at me, but I know it's not at me. And what I always say to them is, I haven't done it to you, it's already been done. And I think to know that, for us to actually understand, when you meet somebody on the street that's really angry, we haven't done it to them, it's already been done.
Hello, welcome to the fourth and last in our podcast series on talking about abortion. We've looked at why we need to talk about abortion, who we need to have in mind when we're talking about abortion, how to handle those conversations, and finally we're going to look at what to expect once we start talking about abortion. So as always, I'm joined by the lovely Rachel Mackenzie from Rachel's Vineyard. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us.
Thank you again for asking me.
So we're looking at what we can expect when we start talking about abortion. And I think maybe looking at this today will help us give that, final bit of confidence that we need to actually start the conversations. So I'm going to get it going. Something that I think for me, when I was talking about abortion, maybe initially having those conversations, and actually this is something I've heard from other people as well, is that it was quite unexpected to not just look at things from a reasonable and a rational perspective. So what I'm saying is, maybe like quite a few people, before getting quite involved proactively with abortion, I'd read a lot about it. I knew, a lot of the kind of scientific arguments and, all the kind of rationale around the pro-life, discussion. And then once I started talking to people, I realised that a lot of the kind of discussions were much more fuelled by emotion rather than anything reasonable. I don't know if that's anything that you encountered when you were talking about abortion, or...
Without a doubt, I'd studied it, I'd read the books, I thought, here we go, I've got all the knowledge. And then you're met with that first barrier, that wall for me of denial. You know what denial stands for? Didn't even know I am lying.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Don't pick each letter because you'll realise what's wrong with it. Yeah, denial. Didn't even know I am lying. And I think, especially I think for post-abortive women and men that go past, they're not at a stage in their own healing to recognise that they're buying into some huge lies, and that it's the truth that'll set them free, but they're not ready to look at that.
Yeah, I think... what I found is that I'd thought of things in a very kind of logical way, and I realised that there wasn't always that consistency with people's arguments. There was quite a lack of consistency with the people I was talking to. So it really required me to go back to the very basics, to do the kind of real groundwork. Sometimes you'd be speaking to a doctor who'd say, oh, I don't think there's life before birth, or something that was just, from a scientific perspective, utterly ridiculous. But, you could see how these things had, just become part of people's thinking because they'd never really stopped to think about them. So I think being prepared for that you might, be thinking, oh, I know all the reasonable, sound, rational arguments for pro-life, but you might be met, like you're saying, with denial, or sometimes just with a lot of emotion when we go into this.
Yeah, and I think if you hear something often enough, you'll believe it. And if you keep hearing over and over again, abortion is healthcare, you've got to break through that denial, first of all, to be able to have a reasonable conversation.
Yeah, I think it's like with a lot of those mantras, my body, my choice, no uterus, no opinion, or whatever, people might not actually think, can I break that down and does it really make sense? It almost just sounds a good supportive statement to what I want to believe, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So anything else that you kind of think maybe is a good thing to expect or at least be prepared for when we're talking about abortion?
Yeah, and I think something that doesn't feel like a good thing, but it's very natural, is anger. That I think we are going to, and I know I have many times come across people that are just really angry. And don't I always say, that for me, I know anger is on its own, it is an emotion and it's a gift from God, but there's always something underneath that anger. And, for post-abortive women, it's often what's underneath that is shame, and the shame of what's happened, and then the real grief of what could have been and what is, that I am a mother. I'd have been a better mother if I'd have carried on with the pregnancy. So I think you're always going to come across anger.
And how can we sort of respond to that? Because sometimes I think the natural thought is almost like, oh gosh, what have I said? I've caused that, me and my big mouth.
Yeah. I think we all, I was chatting to you earlier about, my go-to is always, I've done something wrong. So if somebody's angry, I used to think, well, I must have caused that in you. And what a mantra, talking about mantras, I have to say on every single retreat at Rachel's Vineyard, when these women have purposely come, and the men, to deal with their grief, often anger will come up, and it can be aimed very much at me, but I know it's not at me. And what I always say to them is, I haven't done it to you, it's already been done. And I think to know that, for us to actually understand, when you meet somebody on the street that's really angry, we haven't done it to them, it's already been done.
That's really helpful. And actually, I remember you telling me in the past a lovely story about a woman who got very angry at her priest. Do you want to just go over that? Because I just think that's a beautiful story.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the fears, isn't it, very much with the priest that we meet, of I don't want to get somebody angry. But yeah, this woman, she was absolutely enraged, and and she stormed out of the church, and she felt like she was being judged, and this was happening and that was happening. And it was just her perception of it through the eyes of somebody that was grieving.
Because I presume then he'd been talking about abortion or something. Yeah,
from the pulpit. He mentioned abortion. He'd also, good man indeed, and he'd also mentioned, the truth and the mercy and the love. And you can go somewhere like Rachel's Vineyard. So she stormed out and rang Rachel's Vineyard, and she spoke to me, and she was livid. And we had a very, very long conversation. That was very much the beginning of her journey of healing, because he had instigated this conversation, and all he had done was just bring the anger to the surface that was already there, because it's already been done.
And that's the thing, though, he just saw an angry woman walk out of his church. So you can see that sometimes you might not see the actual fruit of maybe bringing that anger to the surface, which is the start of somebody's healing journey. So far from doing something wrong, it can actually be the start of something really good.
Exactly that.
And I do think maybe to start with anger, that we just have to sometimes almost be like a sponge and absorb it to start with. I know sometimes, because obviously we're just talking about conversations that might happen at any time in everyday life. But I know, like, when I've been doing, 40 Days for Life and maybe praying near an abortion centre, sometimes you'll get somebody passing by who just seems to get triggered and can be quite angry, or sometimes it's been somebody driving past. And when that happens, I think initially sometimes you just have to, like I say, just be silent and absorb it, because that person maybe isn't in a frame of mind to actually hear anything right now. They just need to be able to kind of let it out, and I think that can sometimes be the initial thing that we need to do.
I think that's a great way of saying it. We just need to absorb it. We don't need to pick it up and throw it back at them. It's the worst thing to do. But I think just to absorb it and allow that. I think a lot of people think that, somebody getting really angry, that it's going to carry on, it's going to escalate. But if you're absorbing it, they get exhausted, and they either walk away or the anger goes down. And then what often follows anger is tears. So I think that's something else you can expect.
Yes,
tears.
And I think, like with anger, a lot of people really fear these kind of strong emotions, which is sometimes why people will say, I don't want to talk about abortion. It's because they're really fearful of somebody either getting angry, somebody getting upset, and just don't know how to deal with that. And I think that's quite understandable. But I think it is good to get used to that, to step away from that, like you were saying, that initial self-doubt of like, what have I done wrong because somebody's crying? and not fear those emotions. And sometimes we just have to kind of be with somebody in their anger, or be with somebody in their grief or sadness, which might be why they're crying, just to help them move forward on their journey.
Yeah. And I think tears, I think they're sacred. And I think, I know we live in a world now of fixing your feelings, mop up your tears. But when you think about Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus, the Son of God, God himself, he knew he was going to raise him from the dead. What did he do first? He grieved. Jesus wept. And you know what? If it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us, and it's good enough for us to be around people and allow them to cry.
Yeah. And I also think that one of the things that we need to kind of bear in mind when we start to talk about abortion is that sometimes we are going to get it wrong. Now, I mean, I know I was just saying that because somebody is angry or because somebody is upset, it doesn't mean we've done anything wrong. But there are times when we will say something wrong. And I think it's almost go into these discussions knowing that will happen at some point. Yes, we need to kind of strategize and plan our conversations and think of, good arguments and think of, like we said, how to be compassionate. But also there are going to be times that we mess up. And we don't want to kind of like get too bogged down in that, because I think sometimes that can be such a sad thing that happens. Someone will say, oh, I messed up, so I've never spoken about abortion again. In fact, I remember hearing somebody saying that 2 years ago they talked about abortion and it went wrong. And so they'd never tried talking about it since. It's like, well, then just learn from that, re-strategize and start again.
And it's crazy when you think about it. If you're going to ride a bike, the first time you're going to fall off it. You don't go, well, I never rode it again. I didn't do this again. We wouldn't be able to read or write or anything. That we do learn from our mistakes. The only reason I can say this about anger and and don't pick it up and throw it back is because I have. Yeah. Because I've done exactly that I have got angry. I have rammed my opinion so far down somebody's throat that I know that I've closed doors. So we just got to learn.
And that's humility, isn't it, really? Being able to apologise if we need to, and not letting that kind of negativity cling to us so that we don't think, I can't talk to that person again, or I can't talk about this subject again. It's like, okay, I made a mistake. I'm sorry about that. But I'm going to learn from that and move forward and talk about this in a better way next time. So anything else then you think that, when talking about abortion that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, I think, that whole idea when you've made a mistake and you haven't got it right, and suddenly the whispers of what I call little red legs, the doubts start to fall in. Am I doing the right thing? Should I be here? So I think that's quite an important
I think it is, because I think in a way it's almost like a kind of spiritual attack, isn't it? And I know, you always call them little red legs. But when we're talking about Satan, I think that is a prime way that he attacks, because so often I've heard people say, maybe they were trying to talk to someone who was considering an abortion, and they didn't feel that they had a successful conversation, or they were talking to someone who'd had an abortion or multiple abortions and maybe didn't feel they really got through to that person. And afterwards there is that sort of tendency to think, like you were just saying, what did I do wrong? What have I done that made me not effective? And you can become very critical of yourself, and that can just be a bit of a spiritual attack, really, from Satan to again immobilize you and silence you.
He started it in the Garden of Eden with, are you sure that's what God said? Are you sure? And it's that same question that he uses today, do you think you made a difference? Oh, I wonder if you've made it worse there. And I think when those doubts, it's really important to know where they came from. And what I always try and do is grass him up by telling somebody again, I feel like I'm not doing any good out here, and getting affirmed and putting you back, no, this is where I'm meant to be.
And I think that's part of maybe a kind of broader point that we need to look at, is that spiritual attack, because once you start engaging in pro-life conversations, which is a really important kind of form of pro-life activism, you will come under spiritual attack, won't you? And I think that's an absolute guarantee in some way or another. And
I don't think you can underestimate how big it is. When I had a huge conversion 17, 18 years ago, I never knew who the devil was because I was doing the devil's work. He left me well alone as I was dancing myself to hell. Had this huge conversion. That's when I knew who the devil was. Mm-hmm. And I thought, this is as bad as it gets in an attack. No, it's the pro-life work. I don't think there's an attack like it.
It's interesting, actually, because I know I was talking to a group of priests who... together they kind of have a rota where they will go to join people outside the abortion centre. So these are men who have already, really given their lives to Christ, who are very much involved in things spiritually. They said once they started doing that, the level of spiritual attack, it suddenly went up a notch. So I do think, when we're engaging in pro-life work, if we think about it, Satan wants to destroy God. And he can't, because that's his creator. So what will he do? He will try and destroy those who are made in the image and likeness of God. And what a perfect way to start from Satan's perspective with the most, innocent, vulnerable child in the womb. So those who are trying to stand up for those children and defend those will really come in his line of sight. And I think that's maybe a kind of reminder that if we're going to get involved in pro-life work, we need to up our game spiritually and make sure that, we're prepared with prayer and a really deep relationship with God, or we're just going to fall to his mercy. Well, he hasn't got any mercy, but fall prey to Satan. And I think also remembering that he is such a bully that he will go for our weakest point. So I think maybe being aware of the strategy sometimes of Satan, that he will look at our weakest points, whether that's our relationships, our work, our financial situation, whatever it might be, and that is where he will target. Yeah. And so kind of being prepared for that. And I think, like you were kind of intimating earlier, when we know where that's coming from, sometimes that just makes it a bit easier to deal with. It's like, I know what this is. It's another attack from you-know-who, and no, I'm not going to fall for that.
Exactly.
And I think just kind of naming it and shaming it.
Without a doubt. And I think also in that is, that we don't speak to Satan. We never speak to him. We don't say, get behind me, Satan, because the only person that ever did that was Jesus. So when I say grass him up, I'm on about, I talk to my good friends, I tell Jesus, I tell God, this is happening. Because we've got a mighty God. That's why I call him Little Red Legs. He's like flipping away.
So beginning to bring this to a close then, Rachel, if you could give some advice to your former self, before you'd started ever talking about abortion, what advice would you give on maybe what to expect in these conversations?
I think it's actually don't expect. It's a don't expect on this one. Don't expect somebody to change their mind, their heart right in front of you, to have that aha moment. I think if we really just begin to expect to plant seeds. Yeah. So if we plant seeds for people, and then somebody else will water it and that's how it'll go along, I think we just need to be part of a bigger picture.
And I think we don't really have a right to always see the fruit of everything that we do we? Certainly, from a Christian perspective, that's something that we'll only know one day up in heaven. We don't always have a right to see every aspect of our conversation and how it might affect somebody's heart.
Yes. And I think occasionally we're very blessed and very lucky that God will allow us to see it. I know for me, I can think of once where I saw, somebody, the penny drop, and it was a friend of mine. She'd been to Rachel's Vineyard. She was round at my house. And she just said out the blue, I still think abortion, is okay for some situations. And within a couple of sentences, she just looked at me. It's like the light went on. And she just said, what was I thinking? Of course, this is never, ever healthcare. This is never a good idea.
What did you say to her then, Rachel? I've got to ask.
It was, if only I'd known the ABC. I trotted the toddler out because there was a toddler next door. And I just said, well, there's a child next door. I know it's crying a lot at the moment. So when you've gone, my plan is to go around and kill that child. And it was just like, yeah, if that child has value and I would stop you going round and prevent that killing, why would I think abortion, the killing of the child in the womb was any different? And she just got it.
Yeah. And of course, sometimes that can be when these strategies do fall into place. I know when you've just mentioned like the ABC and the trot out the toddler, these are things that we talk about at the Rethink Abortion Day on how to really prepare ourselves for the strategy that we have when those kind of conversations come up. So I think it is important to be prepared so that we can have a constructive conversation, but maybe not expecting everyone to suddenly go, oh wow, I'm pro-life now, or I can see exactly what you mean. It doesn't always happen like that.
No.
I think maybe one of the final things I would say then is when we're talking about abortion, yes, we can sometimes expect people who've had abortion or multiple abortions to maybe be quite emotionally affected. Also, if we're talking to people who are considering an abortion, then they might need some signposting of where to go and where to get help. But there's a lot of other sort of periphery issues, I would say. So, for example, I know when I've been doing some pro-life prayers at my church, there's a couple who come to that church, a lovely couple, and they've said that sometimes when we've done that, all they could think about was the miscarriage that they had years ago, and how upsetting that was. Not that there was anything wrong with bringing that up in prayer, but it was just a really emotional time for them. So sometimes people who've been through a miscarriage can be affected, or sometimes it might be those who really want a child and just can't have one, or maybe somebody who lost a child after they were born at any stage, or people who've been through abuse, because often abuse is part of the abortion story. And I know this from what you've told me about Rachel's Vineyard, that often that is the backstory to abortion. So I think sometimes we might think that we're starting a conversation about abortion, but then something else surfaces: the miscarriage, the abuse, the desire for a child that can't be fulfilled. And we need to be prepared to know, where can I signpost these people to? Can I say for the abuse victim, you might want to go to Grief to Grace, or, to someone else, have you heard of this organisation? One of the kind of go-tos can be the March for Life website, which has obviously got a lot of pro-life organisations on that can help with these issues. But I think it can be useful before starting having a conversation about abortion to kind of find out, is there anything particularly in my area where I can signpost people to? And if not, what are the national organisations that can help with these kind of issues? Because sometimes we have to just pause the conversation about abortion and minister to that person where they are now. And we might not be able to do that fully. We're not all professionals trained in counselling. We might need to say, okay, I think maybe there's another organisation that might be able to help you with this, and know where to kind of signpost people to with that. So I think like storing those on your phone or something like that can be a useful thing before you start those conversations. So really, we want to encourage you now to get started. What's stopping you? Why talking about abortion is so important. Who to bear in mind when having these conversations. We've given you some tips on how to, and we've also told you a little bit about what to expect. So we really hope that you've got a bit more confidence in starting a pro-life conversation. And we'd love to hear from you in how these conversations go, good or bad. Drop us an email, send us a message, and let us know how these conversations go. And please subscribe to our channels and share these podcasts so that other people can learn a little bit about talking effectively about abortion. And thank you for joining us today.